Okay, let's go ahead and now talk about the new philosophical position we'll look at in philosophical ethics called utilitarianism. Let me make this as big as I can. And we're going to focus on that version of utilitarianism formulated by John Stuart Mill. Okay, so he was not the inventor of utilitarianism, but he ends up formulating a very powerful version of it. And his is the one that serves as an introduction to utilitarianism about 95% of the time, or even more often. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's talk about its historical origins. Utilitarianism is an ethical doctrine. It was invented by Jeremy Bentham, born in 1748, died in 1832, and he gave it its first systematic presentation, or it was given its first systematic presentation in his Principles of Morals and Legislation. Pardon the typo there, was given. It rests upon the principle that an action is right if it promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number. That's sort of the bald formulation. So we're thinking about happiness now, okay? And we're thinking about the number of people affected by one's action. So this is a form of eudaimonism, all right? That is, it aims at happiness. So it's redefined happiness. With Aristotle, it was a virtuous activity of reason. Okay, for Mill, we'll see it basically is understood as pleasure. So, and it was Bentham who was responsible for understanding happiness as pleasure in this utilitarian framework. Okay, and that position is called hedonism. So we have eudaimonism and hedonism combined. All right. Now, we've already seen that Thomas Hobbes, in fact, identified the good as pleasure. So this idea that the good is pleasure, or that the good is pleasure, and it's not virtue, and it's not friendship, it's not knowledge, and so on and so forth. It's not holiness, right? This idea goes back at least to Hobbes. Now, truth be told, it actually goes back to Greek antiquity, and the originator of this doctrine was a gentleman named Epicurus, E-P-I-C-U-R-U-S. So utilitarianism is really ultimately an outgrowth of an ancient doctrine, the doctrine of Epicurus, or the Epicureans, Epicureanism, all right? So there's a long tradition here. And persons who identify the good with pleasure, or identify it as pleasure, right? They tend to be, pardon me, of course they're hedonists by definition. They tend to be materialists. They believe that, they believe in one of two things, either atheistic naturalism, which Hobbes seems to believe, or, though he denies it in his official writings, but he sort of had to do that in order not to get in trouble with the law at that time. Or they are theistic naturalists, as was Epicurus. Epicurus believed that there were gods, multiple gods in the universe, but they were they lived apart from us and had no relationship to us. They did not involve themselves in our affairs. Praying to them will boot you nothing. Neither will they punish you. They were not concerned with you at all. That was Epicurus's point of view. When we get to John Stuart Mill, I might as well anticipate that. Mill thought that probably God exists. Okay, probably God exists. And he was a fairly rigorous reasoner as far as things go, so he must have had some arguments that he thought showed, some inductive arguments that he thought showed that probability. So the first person to articulate the principle of utility was Francis Hutcheson in an inquiry into the origin of our ideas of beauty and virtue. Okay? That was published in 1729. So Francis Hutcheson, while he didn't invent utilitarianism as a worked out ethical theory, he did discover the principle of utility. David Hume introduced the word utility in his treatise on human nature, from which Bentham adopted it. So, and all these persons are in the same area. By the way, I should mention that it's not merely atheistic naturalists and theistic naturalists who identify the good with pleasure. There's also a position that today we call phenomenalism. They wouldn't have called it that back then. But that's the idea that, well, we can't prove that external reality exists, but we do have phenomena. You have your sensation of the taste of the orange juice as it's going down your throat, of the sound of the violin as the violinist pulls the bow across the string. You have the sensation of the pressure on your body as you lay in your bed, and so on and so forth. You have experience of the phenomena, right? So it's called phenomenalism. Phenomenalists, or persons who adhere to David Hume's phenomenalism, it's called empiricism, but that's a kind of ambiguous word. They too tend to be hedonists, okay? All right. So you take David Hume and Francis Hutcheson, you put them together. A fellow named Jeremy Bentham comes along later, and he reads them and others, and he then formulates the philosophy, the moral philosophy of utilitarianism. Okay, so much for the history. So there are actually two versions. We've already anticipated this. There's Bentham's version and there's Mill's version. So Bentham's version of utilitarianism may here be called democratic utilitarianism. What do I mean by that? Well, it's because his version assigns value indiscriminately to high and to low pleasures, simply on the basis of intensity or degree. And so that motivates us to look for a way of distinguishing between so-called high and low pleasures. But you know, the pleasures of listening to Beethoven's string quartet, or looking at paintings in a museum, or engaging in high-minded charity work or something of that sort, philanthropy, or sort of thing Mill would be into, or studying physical chemistry just for the sake of studying it, so you master the science, so you know something about nature. Those would be, to the degree those are pleasant, those would be higher pleasures, okay? But then, you know, going bowling, enjoying oneself on a roller coaster, playing a video game, by the standards of the folks we're talking about here, those would be lower pleasures. But Bentham would say, okay, we have to put all those in the same category. All that matters is the intensity or degree of the pleasure. Okay? Forget about the quality. Put that to one side. Whatever affords pleasure enters into one's ethical calculations. And we'll look at how to do those calculations fairly soon. So John Stuart Mill, and you can see his years there, was born the son of James Mill, a follower of Bentham and a member of the utilitarian social reform movement. He introduced what we will term aristocratic utilitarianism. By the way, they call themselves the radical philosophers. So Mill, for him, listening to Beethoven, engaging in high-minded philanthropy, studying physical chemistry, right? Those belong in one category. Going bowling, playing a video game, so on and so forth. Those belong in another category. Now, some of you are saying, well, some of these video games can be intellectually stimulating. Okay, so then there's room for discussion. But generally, there is this distinction, and there may be a kind of middle ground where things grade into one side or the other, and then utilitarians who follow Mill would have to go about making those distinctions in a convincing way so that we actually have a workable ethical doctrine to work with. Okay, we can't do that in an introductory course. Okay, so these things are not to be equally valued, high pleasures and low pleasures. To put it as forcefully as we can, the experience of Beethoven is categorically superior to that of bowling for Mill, and we'll return to that point. So Mill, a little more history for you, he received a superlative education. He could read ancient Greek by the age of 5. And he began, I'm sorry, maybe I'm wrong about that. Could he read it by 5, or did he begin at 5? I think he could read it by 5. He had read nearly all of Greek and Latin literature available at that time by the age of 12. He started on Latin later when he was 8 years old. But at the age of 20, he experienced what he describes as a mental crisis. And we'll let him describe this for us. So he writes, "It occurred to me to put the question directly to myself. Suppose that all your objects in life were realized, that all the changes in institutions and opinions which you are looking forward to can be completely affected at this very instant." Because he had been enlisted into the cause, he sort of had been shaped into a radical philosopher by his dad. And let's say they succeeded in getting everything they wanted. Would this be a great joy and happiness to you? And an irrepressible self-consciousness distinctly answered, no. And he then concluded, "I seem to have nothing left to live for," right? Okay, that would be as if, Nancy Pelosi or Bill Clinton said to themselves, what if we reshape the United States in exactly the image that we would desire? We made it exactly what we want it to be. Our values triumphed over the conservatives and persons on the right we've been struggling against now our entire lives. And they said, would we feel satisfied? What if they said to themselves, no, right? That would be kind of a disaster because they just put their entire lives into that. Or if Donald Trump were to say, what if I were to triumph? Would I feel satisfied? And in a quiet moment by himself, a little voice stated in his mind, no, right? So that'd be the kind of experience. All right, so now let's take this further. Mill, and these biographical observations have become very kind of more relevant for Mill, right, than for many other philosophers. So Mill found a kind of solution to his malaise in the writings of the Romantic poets, particularly Coleridge and Wordsworth. Coleridge of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner fame, and Wordsworth of Intimations of Immortality. So I recommend you type those into a search engine. You can at least familiarize yourself with the existence of these things. Intimations of Immortality by Wordsworth and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Coleridge. So from this reading of these authors, and others, many others actually, Mill thought he had been awakened to the realm of feelings to which he had been previously dead. Okay? He had been given a very rationalistic upbringing, and the cultivation of the feelings had been left to one side. But the Romantics, they were concerned with two things, well, three things particularly. Nature, okay? The imagination, that's number two, and feelings, okay? Those three things. Incidentally, footnote for you, the Romantics ended up being very interested, particularly German Romantics, particularly interested in the medieval period. They looked upon that as a period of great romance and of feeling, if you like, imagination. So the remainder of his philosophical project consisted in his unifying the Romantic philosophy of feeling with the rationalist utilitarianism that had formed the backbone of his primary education. So this is what he would try to work out. Okay, and in his mind, this was the project for everyone to work out. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bothered with it. So this accounts psychologically for his elevation of higher and denigration of lower pleasures, right? Because it was through his encounter with high literature that he was brought out of his malaise. And it was these pleasures, right, which are the ones that count. You follow me? The low pleasures don't provide one with meaning, at least for Mill. They didn't provide him with meaning, and now he's taking himself as the template and model for all human beings, as we all do, right? You have to be reflective and kind of be on guard against that sort of thing. And since, eating a hot dog and kind of sitting on the lawn just didn't do it for him, that didn't make his life meaningful, but reading Coleridge did, then clearly the only pleasures that count are the higher pleasures, okay? So that's his, simplifying it maybe a bit, but I think that basically strikes out in the right direction. So let's talk about the principle of utility itself. So we've already seen a version of the principle of utility, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, right? But Mill formulates it so that one can assign a choice and its corresponding action a degree of rightness. We haven't gotten to that concept yet. So your choices and your actions can be right or wrong to varying degrees, okay? let's see how that works. An action is right as it tends to promote a balance of pleasure over pain. Follow? As it tends to. Wrong as it tends to promote a balance of pain over pleasure. So you might have three choices available to you. One would enact the greatest degree of happiness for the greatest number. Another one would also enact a pretty good degree of happiness for the greatest number, right? And a third would actually yield pain. So the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number, that's simply right relative to that situation. That's the choice you should make. The one that promotes happiness, not the greatest, but the happiness for a certain number of people, right? That would be right to that degree. It wouldn't be so much a wrong choice. It would be less wise than the first choice. And the one that would promote pain in that instance would just be flat wrong. Okay. And you can imagine another one that promoted an even greater degree of pain, right? And that one would be the worst of the bunch. Okay, so his formulation requires clarification and qualification. In a situation where there is at least one choice promoting a balance of pleasure over pain, that choice which promotes the greatest balance is right simply. But in a situation where all available choices produce a balance of pain over pleasure, what if you're in a concentration camp or something like that? That choice which promotes the least balance of pain over pleasure is right simply. Do you follow? So people find themselves in tough situations, okay? And then they have to make the choice which promotes the least amount of pain. There are persons who are struggling with addiction right now, and any direction they turn, they're looking at pain, and then they reason it out and arrive at the correct conclusion. I have to follow the path, however painful it may be, over the short haul of breaking the addiction, right? And that can be very painful for whatever period of time, 2 or 3 months when one's breaking the addiction, but then that pays off later. So calculations. Now, in classical utilitarianism, which many people still adhere to, is actually rather curious. When we introduce utilitarianism, we teach Mill. When people become, as it were, professional utilitarians, they go back to Bentham. So let's talk about that, the Benthamite calculus of pleasure and pain. So calculations are performed by multiplying the probability of the outcome of a choice by the degree of pleasure or pain it would produce, okay? So the probability of the outcome is multiplied by the value. So pleasure is a positive value and pain is a negative value, okay? So the probability of the outcome, let's make it simple, is 1. And the amount of pleasure you would produce is, say, on a scale of 1 to 10 is 5, and the value of that choice is 5. If the probability of an outcome is about half, right, 0.5, and the amount of pleasure you would have produced would be 5, right, then the value of the action is 2.5. Okay, guys, you can just spin those out indefinitely. And that can become much more complicated, and people pursue that even in social science and economics to a degree. They pursue it ad nauseum to a point where it's as complicated as anything can get. So your value may then be compared to other choices, like in a scale that we imagined up there, and then you pick the one that produces the balance of pleasure and pain, most favorable to pleasure. Okay. That choice which on balance most favors pleasure. So pure utilitarianism is a mathematical theory of moral rightness, all right? And so it participated in this whole spirit of enlightenment, the idea that we can mathematize everything. And look, Sir Isaac Newton managed to construct a mathematical theory of motion that applies both to the heavens and to the terrestrial sphere. Prior to him, people had split those two apart mainly. And it was through his mathematical genius and the application of a mathematical method that we're now able to make all sorts of wonderful predictions. Can't we take the method of mathematics and bring it into human affairs, right? That's what many persons were aspiring for, Bentham and other persons surrounding him. And it's what, in a way, triumphs as far as getting funding, so on and so forth, right? And so we have various scientific studies of human nature, particularly in psychology departments and sociology departments. Incidentally, a unit of pleasure in Bentham is called a hedon, and a unit of pain is called a lupon. Okay, now the formulation we've looked at is susceptible to a couple of confusions. The greatest happiness for the greatest number does not mean either of the following two misunderstandings. Let's look at them. First, it does not mean that action which promotes the highest degree of pleasure is right. It does not mean simply that action which promotes the highest degree of pleasure is right. So grant that a sadist may derive, you know what a sadist is, somebody that likes causing pain in people. Grant that he may derive a higher degree of pleasure from torturing a victim than the victim would take in not being tortured, okay? The fact that his pleasure is of a very high degree must be balanced against the fact that his victim's pain is also of a very high degree, not to mention the distress of the victim's family would also be very great. So you have to add the distress of the family plus the person being tortured, and the fact that the sadist is getting some kind of strange thrill from what he is doing, a Marquis de Sade type person, that would not justify, that would not make his choice of torturing that person right. So you rule that out just on the basis of simple mathematics. So next error people sometimes make: the principle of utility does not countenance, that means approve, merely securing some small degree of happiness for the greatest number. For example, imagine that I had $10. Well, then I could split it into 100 dimes, right? And I could distribute those 100 dimes between 100 people. The effect on their happiness would be very slight or nothing whatsoever, right? How happy would you guys be if I handed you a dime? Like, okay, well, it's a dime, right? So let us say that I enjoyed the alternative of buying a hot meal for a very hungry and destitute man. It is easy to see that the pleasure he would take from this meal would well exceed the pleasure of the 100 persons with their dimes, right? And you can do that. You can, you can do something that's actually within reach. You can just go to a food bank and donate $10. Hence, the right choice in this case would be to purchase the man the hot meal, okay? Because that would actually be the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So I wouldn't affect you guys at all, except maybe a little bit if you saw me do it or you approved of the fact that I was helping this fellow. But most of you would have no idea that I did it, and I wouldn't brag about it, so you wouldn't know. But the greatest happiness for the greatest number would be to buy this man that food. It would not be to include all of you in some little minuscule degree of pleasure, right? A fraction of a hedon. Adding all those together, it's less than the pleasure of the starving man and getting that hot meal. Okay, so that's clear enough. So characteristics of utilitarianism. So I have to, let's see here. We've already had occasion, is this going to work? So first thing, it was so obvious I didn't put it in here. The first thing is that it's a type of eudaimonism. Okay, let's make this bigger again. Okay, so it's a type of eudaimonism. We've commented on that. Happiness is the end, not duty, right? Happiness, not duty, not something else. We've also seen that Millian utilitarianism takes the form of an aristocratic hedonism. So now we have two features or characteristics. It's a eudaimonism, and it's an aristocratic hedonism. Okay. There are other features. While it shares with Hobbes the doctrine that the good is pleasure, it rejects ethical egoism in favor of ethical altruism. Okay? That is, one ought to benefit others. Ought to. It's ethical altruism. You ought to do it. So note that Mill has to assume psychological altruism as well. Otherwise, ethical altruism emerges stillborn, right? So psychological altruism teaches that one can be motivated from concern for others. So Mill allows that that's possible. You can love somebody and want what is good for that person, or just be concerned for some stranger you just met and want what's good for him. And that is a kind of love too, by the way. All right. So since actions are right insofar as they favor a balance of pleasure over pain, or the least balance of pain over pleasure in tough situations. For a multitude, of course, the pleasures and pains of each person affected by an action are to count equally. Now, pleasures don't count equally, but people count equally. You follow me? Because we have to count everybody and get them into that that calculus. Okay, because these are the persons affected by the action, so we have to consider the pleasures and pains, and with Mill, the high quality pleasures and pains that they experience. As far as low quality pleasures and pains, either there are two choices there. Either they're assigned a very tiny degree of value, right? Or their value is dismissed. And when you read through Mill, it looks like, you know, the value, the pleasure of eating a sloppy Joe or riding a roller coaster gets zero value. Okay, that sounds a little radical. So maybe there's a radical strain in Mill. I don't think many people would follow him there. So you can just say that if you're going to make Mill work, you can take those lower pleasures and assign them a lesser value than the higher pleasures of listening to Beethoven and doing charity work and things of that sort. Okay. So if each person counts as one and no more than one, we're looking at egalitarianism. So that's an easy way to memorize this. For Mill, each person counts as one and no more than one. All right. Now, can I suggest something? That looks like Mill is concerned with justice. We shouldn't count anyone beyond what is due relative to that person. No one should be given undue consideration, you follow? And to assign somebody undue consideration in performing one's utility calculations, which are moral calculations, one's guilty of injustice. So it seems that Mill is actually concerned with justice behind the scenes here. And if he's concerned with justice, well, one can say, well, you know, then you are actually concerned with something that is coordinate with, but distinct from happiness. And so that actually your system has two values and two things that are intrinsically good. That is happiness understood as pleasure, which is intrinsically good, or realistically a balance of pleasure over pain, because you can't get rid of pain. And justice, on the other hand, right? Okay, that seems to be something one can say to Mill. He doesn't point that out for you. I'm doing that. Okay, it almost resembles an objection, right? So you know, it's not just happiness is pleasure, Mill. It's justice too, isn't it? Okay, that complicates your doctrine a bit and makes it look rather different from how you present it. Okay, maybe he has a reply to that. Finally, since what makes the difference between degrees of rightness and wrongness are consequences and not motivations, not intentions, not intending the right thing, not ethical habits, nothing to do with your soul, okay? Mill's theory is a type of consequentialism. All that matters are the consequences, and there's only one consequence that matters, and that is the degree to which you produce a balance of pleasure over pain, or if there are only generally speaking, bad outcomes available, that balance which produces the least balance of pain over pleasure. Okay? Right, you're aiming at two things, either the greatest balance of pleasure over pain, or if that's not possible, the least balance of pain over pleasure, one or the other. Okay, so let's move on. So now we can talk about wicked versus honest pleasures. So going back to Hobbes, we argued in his case he confronted a difficulty. That is, his doctrine that the good is pleasure resting on the observation. Let me try to break the sentence down. His doctrine that the good is pleasure rests on the observation that pleasure is, in being experienced or projected, necessarily taken to be good. Okay? That is, when you're experiencing the pleasure of drinking orange juice, you can't not take that pleasure to be good. You guys follow me? Okay. And when you experience the pleasure of just sitting on a lawn, you can't not take that pleasure to be good because the goodness is kind of built into the experience. You guys follow me? However, so from that, it would seem Hobbes then draws the inference that the good is pleasure. Then we saw that this idea that the good is pleasure, well, let me back it up. Then we saw that this idea that one can't help but take pleasures to be good, that actually is contradicted by the nearly universal judgment of our species. because everyone agrees that there are evil pleasures. The pleasures, some people take pleasure in murdering people and in raping people and humiliating people and doing other evil things. Okay? Are those pleasures good? So I would venture to say, 95 to 97% of the species would say that those pleasures are evil pleasures. Okay? So that to be pleasure is not straight away to be something good. There are good pleasures and there are evil pleasures. All right. So to counter this objection, Hobbes would then have to introduce a criterion by which one could distinguish between good and evil pleasures. By the way, notice he can't say that the good is good pleasure. That's circular. He would say, oh, no. I don't mean that the good is pleasure simply. I mean that the good is identical with the good pleasures. Yeah, then you're defining the word good with the word good, right? And then you're traveling in a circle. It doesn't help. So what Hobbes would have to do is introduce a criterion by which one could distinguish between good and evil pleasures. So that with the criterion, with the good pleasures on one side, but the evil pleasures on the other side. Make any sense? But this necessarily would have to be something other than pleasure itself. Obviously, right? It can't be pleasure that does that. Because there are evil pleasures. Okay. But then the goodness of the good pleasures would consist in something other than pleasure, and hedonism would be false. Read that last sentence again. The goodness of the good pleasures, the goodness that makes them good, that would consist in something other than there being pleasure, because the evil pleasures are pleasure as well. And so hedonism would be false. Okay? In sum, hedonism faces a very serious problem. The problem is that it's not the case that if something is pleasant, then it's good, because most people don't agree with that. Put psychopaths and sociopaths to one side. 97% of the species doesn't agree with that. Okay? So some pleasures are actually bad. So now we need some kind of criterion for identifying the good pleasures, so we can segregate those from the bad pleasures, and we can pursue the good ones, put the bad ones to one side. And that criterion obviously cannot be pleasure, because evil pleasures are pleasant as well. They are instances of pleasure. And now this criterion would be that which would explain, right? Invoking it would play some sort of explanatory role in explaining why the good pleasures are good. It would be that which makes them good. And that would mean that the good is this particular feature insofar as it adheres in certain pleasures. And that's not hedonism. That's hedonism plus whatever that criteria may be. It could be order, it could be functionality, whatever. Okay, so Mill, he wants to address this difficulty. All right. So Mill distinguishes not merely good from evil pleasures, but he makes the matter even more difficult for himself. He distinguishes high from low pleasures. And most people enjoy low pleasures. I like sitting on a lawn in the park. Some of you are saying, why is that a lower pleasure, Dr. Shakiyar? Maybe that's not a good example of a low pleasure, right? Maybe Mill would count that as a high pleasure. I don't know. Riding a roller coaster for him. There were no roller coasters back then, but he was that kind of guy. He probably turned his nose up at the idea of getting on a roller coaster. And he would say, well, a lot of people like riding roller coasters, and I like eating, sloppy joes, so on and so forth. What's so low about those things? Or let's grant that they're low. What's so bad about having a couple of low pleasures here or there, right? What's wrong with that? Okay, so Mill wants to give you some kind of account which will enable you to see the distinction and come to want to agree with him, because then once you see the distinction and why the distinction is real, you'll then want to cultivate tastes in higher pleasures. And once you do that, you'll prefer higher pleasures, and as a matter of course, you'll choose them over low pleasures. What my students usually say is, well, I like listening to classical music, and I like listening to heavy metal, and so on and so forth. Okay. So what Mill does, he introduces this idea of the competent judge, all right? So Mill confronts the same difficulty of seemingly having to acknowledge that there is a non-hedonistic principle of goodness that not only enables us to make the distinction we want, but compels one possessing the criterion to make it. Now for Mill, once again, now he puts the idea of evil pleasures to one side. Those are straight away low, even beyond low, they're evil. And he wants to distinguish high from low pleasures. Now, what would that external principle be that would enable us to distinguish between those high and low pleasures? Well, being internally ordered, okay, having a function performed for its own sake, like thinking or sensing or something like that in Aristotle, being ordered to God in the system of Aquinas or another philosophical theologian, right? You can invoke those. So what you can call all those substantive principles of goodness: internal order, functionality that is itself done for its own sake, it is an end, being ordered to God. You can call all those things constitutive or substantive principles of goodness. Mill doesn't want any of those, okay? He wants to stick with his strict hedonism. So what he attempts to do is to introduce a non-substantive criterion, okay? And what's that non-substantive criterion, if anything? It's the criterion of the competent judge, all right? The competent judge is a person. This person has enjoyed both high and low pleasures. He has a kind of comprehensive experience of pleasure, all right? I think Mill would insist that he's avoided the evil pleasures, right? Because he doesn't want to corrupt anybody, but that might be a little bit of a difficulty, but let's leave it at that. Those who enjoy both the high and the low pleasures are in the position to judge that high pleasures are preferable to low pleasures. And then he says, this in fact is what they will always do. So if you have somebody who really has, I mean, it takes a while. You can study some music theory, do some ear training, you'll learn how to play the piano a bit. You get to the point where you can hear some of the nuances going on in the performance of a string quartet or whatever it may be, or some high-level jazz performance where the Chick Corea playing with Vinnie Colaiuta and whoever else, and you're listening to the guys and you're saying to yourself, how can they play at that level? It's incredible. All right, and I have a little bit of a musical education, and once you acquire it, because I remember what it was like not to have that musical education, and what it's like to have it now. Yeah, you definitely hear stuff that you didn't hear before. Okay. And so he says, once you have it, once you've cultivated those tastes, also in painting and sculpture, and you also get off your duff and do something for people in need, marginalized groups, the poor and the like. You do something to further education, and you begin taking college courses just for the sake of taking them, just so you can expand your knowledge base. Okay. If you keep that up, you will acquire the capacity of the competent judge, and you'll be able to state with authority, because you've had the range of experiences, that the experiences in pursuit of truth, of goodness and beauty, or maybe aesthetic experiences, if you like, that's preferable to the sloppy Joe and the roller coaster followed by a Metallica concert. Okay. So I do not take him to be saying that a competent judge will always choose a higher pleasure. He didn't say that, because anyone can suffer from occasional weakness of will, maybe a little tired or something, or just having a bad day. What he's saying is that he will infallibly judge that higher pleasures are higher and that lower pleasures are lower, and that's that. Okay. And how do we know he's getting it right? Because other competent judges will agree with him. And I have to say, there is something to it. I mean, there is nobody who is a fan of classical music who thinks that Beethoven is incompetent, or that his 14th string quartet is a vulgar piece of trash or something of that sort. That just doesn't happen. There are people who don't like Beethoven so much because he's very passionate. There's some anger in his music, and they don't like him because of that. They don't maintain that he was a hack. I mean, no one says that. Okay. You know which professional composers admire most? If you look at 20th century composers and beyond, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I read a book of interviews with like Bartók and Stravinsky and all these famous 20th century composers. One of the first questions they would ask is, who's your favorite composer? And they would usually list two. The first one was Mozart every time. Interesting. All right, so thus we are to take the competent judge as a kind of authoritative guide to the world of pleasures. Okay? In this way, he is analogous to the wise man in Aristotle, one of whose functions is to provide others with a model of wise action. That is, the correct grasp of particulars, the setting up of the appropriate end, and the adoption of the most judicious means to the attainment of that end. Okay, what's the just thing to do in this circumstance? You have to have a grasp of the situation, the people concerned, their various claims, right? You then have a concept of what the just outcome would be, and then you put into motion a series of steps which will achieve that just outcome. Only the competent judge for Mill plays a purely epistemic, that has to do with knowledge, and justificatory role in enabling humankind in general to know which pleasures are higher and which are lower. You guys follow me? Mill presumably meant a man such as himself, okay? And not being terribly humble, right? You guys following? So this person, he's not going to tell you how to conduct yourself, but he will tell you which pleasures are better and which are lower. He won't tell you what steps to take in order to achieve higher pleasures, but he will be able to tell you what the higher pleasures are. Then it's up to you to figure out what the steps are, okay? He won't help you grasp particulars, give you a model of a person with presence of mind, as it were. He might have presence of mind, he might not, but he will give you a reliable judgment as to what's higher and what's lower. All right. As far as ethical models, Mill simply doesn't talk about them in utilitarianism. Not to my recollection. Maybe he mentions one, but it's not a theme of his. So there are criticisms. His theory, and utilitarianism in general, has been on the receiving end of numerous criticisms. Okay, here they are. First, utilitarianism produces counterintuitive results. Let's consider this. If two actions, one of which involves lying, and the other of which is honest through and through, lead to exactly the same outcome, the same balance of pleasure over pain, then by the lights of utilitarianism, there is no moral difference between the two actions, right? One, you lie your way to a good outcome, and the second way, you pursue an honest course to the same outcome. That means all that matters are the consequences. That means the two actions are morally equivalent. But that contradicts a moral intuition. Our moral intuition is that the honest path is preferable to the path of lying. Okay? So Mill responds to this objection. He says that what we need to do is adopt a rule utilitarianism as opposed to an act utilitarianism. So an act utilitarianism maintains that we have to perform our utility calculations afresh every time we make a choice. Rule utilitarianism maintains what we need to do is come up with a game plan, a set of rules, if you like, a natural law, right? That if we adhere to it rigorously over time, it will produce the best expected outcome with respect to a balance of pleasure over pain. So then we end up back with basically the table of the 10 Commandments, or you can modify it slightly, all right? So according to Mill, acting on the rule to tell the truth and avoid uttering falsehoods promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number over the long haul, right? So that's stated, most utilitarians are act utilitarians. So they have to address this criticism. It's a rather curious feature of the utilitarian world, that most utilitarians are act utilitarians, despite this rather significant difficulty in others we'll get to. Okay. Second criticism. Mill's consequentialism produces the peculiar result that if a well-intended action, remember the intention doesn't mean anything, but if a well-intended action produces a bad consequence by accident, then that choice and the action were morally wrong. That's also counterintuitive. It contradicts our moral intuitions. So, for example, if a man meets his friend to loan the latter money needed to pay his mortgage, and the friend is killed by a driver on the way to the meeting, then the consequence of the man's choice caused considerable pain for the dying man and for his family. The pain that he experienced while he was dying, and the devastation the family experiences in losing him. It would have been better had he not offered him the money at all, and then the person would have maybe done a short sale with the bank and got something from his house. or walked away, maybe $10,000, $20,000 in debt or something. But by the lights of consequentialism, his action, which was intended to be generous, was wrong. Okay? This is strange and departs entirely from how we talk about rightness and wrongness. Okay? You guys follow me? You might feel guilty about proposing that you meet your friend at some coffee shop, and as he's crossing the street, he gets mowed down. You might say, oh, in some sense it's my fault. But then everyone would reassure you and tell you, no, it's not your fault, right? You couldn't possibly have known that this driver was going to appear out of nowhere. So you might feel guilty. That's a psychological fact, but you wouldn't really be guilty, okay? All right. Third point here. Mill's theory can seem to have a chilling effect on relations to those who are nearest and dearest. Pardon me for a second. If everyone is to count as one and no more than one, then one is not to count the good of one's family and closest friends as of greater weight than that of strangers, provided that these strangers are affected by the action. This could lead to one's justifying, for example, putting a neighbor's child through college rather than one's own on account of the neighbor's child having demonstrated a greater degree of intellectual promise. Okay, so now your love for your child is to be put to one side. And what Mill is saying is not that you personally should adopt this philosophy. The entire world should. So everyone has to put their love for their children and loyalty to blood to one side. That basically has to be a thing of the past, made a thing of the past. You guys follow? And we're just going to engage in the cool-headed, cool, hard logic of utilitarianism. Okay. So now Mill might reply that one of the results of rule utilitarianism would be you help the persons who are closest to you because if you don't, no one else will. And everybody has persons closest to them, and so if we all help the people closest to us, everyone gets covered, or most people get covered, or more people get covered than would otherwise happen if people just had to kind of work it out fresh every time and think about which people they could benefit and who to leave out of the range of their beneficence. It just simplifies things extraordinarily and leads to the best overall outcome. And you could argue that way. Might work, okay? Help those who are nearest so more people will be covered if you adopt that rule than not. Than otherwise, pardon me. So fourth, it is impossible actually to calculate all of the consequences of any of one's choices. This is the incalculability objection, okay? This makes it impossible to apply the theory, right? So right now you're going to make a choice. You choose to continue listening to this lecture. What are the consequences of that choice? Well, your knowledge of John Stuart Mill will increase. You'll have a better chance of getting a better grade on the quiz, next quiz. You will be able to talk about Mill more articulately with other people, maybe informing them about utilitarianism. And what will be the consequence of those consequences? Remember, consequences have consequences too. The consequences of the consequences are consequences of the original choice. Well, we don't know exactly what those will be, but we know that they will be, unless the universe blinks out of existence, right? And then there will be consequences of the consequences of the consequences, and so on, to the 100th, the 1,000th, the 10,000th degree. So you don't really know what all the consequences of your actions are going to be. You just don't know. Okay? If you don't know, you can't actually apply the theory, because you can't calculate the consequences. So much for utilitarianism, right? Okay, so this objection seems effective with an E, seems effective against act utilitarianism, but doesn't really affect Mill's utilitarianism, his rule utilitarianism. Because he would say, well, I'm not going to worry about that. All I know is that the overall outcome over the long haul will be the best if we obey certain moral rules concerning assaulting people and theft, murder, lying, adultery, and things of that sort. Okay. Fifth point, pleasure is seen to be incommensurable. Now, what does incommensurable mean? Well, it's the opposite of commensurables. If two things are commensurable, they have a common measure, like two lengths. on a field. You can measure them, compare them. Say this one's longer than another. Two things are incommensurable. There is no common measure. You can't really compare them, except abstractly. You can hold one. I can think about the number 7 and a banana at the same time. But when thinking about the number 7 and a banana at the same time, I realize there's really nothing further I can say about this comparison, right? One's a number, an abstract object. The second thing that I'm imagining is a material object. I'm imagining a material object. So how is one to compare the pleasures of contemplation, spending time with a favorite uncle, eating a chocolate brownie, and enjoying runner's high? Which of these gets a 10, which a lower value, and which the lowest? Is there one scale on which to measure these pleasures? Okay, it seems not really, right? How do you compare these things? You know, the pleasures of mystical contemplation or study of science or spending time with someone you love versus eating a banana split or going for a jog. Where's the common measure there? How do you rate these things on a scale of 1 to 10? Spending time with your uncles at a 6. Mystical contemplation is an 8. What? That doesn't sound very plausible, right? So this objection, the incommensurability objection, this would undermine all of utilitarianism, rule as well as act utilitarianism, because rule utilitarianism depends upon the homogeneity of pleasures and the idea that it's meaningful to say that if we follow these rules, then there will be an outcome which is favorable to pleasure. It will favor the greatest balance of pleasure over pain in the future. Okay. Because there is no such thing as a homogeneous field of pleasure. You can't produce an outcome which favors pleasure over pain if there is no such thing as pleasure as such, right? There's no genus of pleasure. There's just different types of pleasure. So Mill could reply to that and say that, well, no, if we follow these certain rules, we'll increase the balance of pleasure over pain for each type of pleasure, right? Forget about trying to aggregate them all together. We'll put the mathematics to one side and just grant that there are diverse pleasures. They do not have a common measure. But if we do follow these rules with respect to each category of pleasure, in its own distinct category by itself, incomparable with the others, each one will enjoy an increase, or each one will be subject to the rule that there will be a balance of pleasure over pain, and the most favorable balance of pleasure over pain. Okay, so maybe Mill has a good reply to that one. It's aimed against him, but maybe it doesn't work. Sixth. Act utilitarianism justifies torturing a small child to death if that were necessary to save a city, or even if it were necessary to achieve a lesser good, right? Provided that the lesser good, I mean, obviously it will be a certain quantum of pleasure, provided it sufficiently outweighs the pain, which would be very significant, by the way, cost to the child. But this is a grave violation of the right of the child and seems impossible to stomach. And it would be morally strained to say that such an action is morally right. Okay. So and some of you, I know, I always had these hard-headed students who say, well, if you have to torture the kid, you have to torture the kid. That's the idea. Well, imagine yourself in the position of the child. Okay. It's easy when you're saying, okay, we can sacrifice a kid. How about you? Are you ready to be sacrificed by some utilitarian who shows up and says, okay, we have to torture you in order to achieve this other good? All right, so that makes it a little bit closer to home and maybe produces a different conclusion in one's own mind. But that's the classical objection to act utilitarianism, namely that it endorses the violation of human rights. Okay. Jeremy Bentham said that rights are nonsense on stilts. So he bit the bullet and said there is no such thing as human rights. And you get rid of those, and you're potentially in a bit of hot water there. We'll talk about that in a second. The seventh objection. So seventh and finally, utilitarianism only admits one positive value, right? There's only one good thing really for the utilitarian, and that is pleasure, or a variety of pleasures if you take Mill's possible reply to the previous objection. It does not admit that any of the following are intrinsically good. Utilitarian denies that knowledge is intrinsically good. He denies that friendship is intrinsically good. He denies that virtue is action, good intentions, holiness, order, symmetry, if that's a good thing in a work of art. He denies that these things are intrinsically good. Nor does utilitarianism admit that persons are good. That's the rub right there. So if there's only one value, and that's pleasure, persons aren't good. Now you recall in Kant, persons have the attribute of dignity. It's also true in St. Thomas Aquinas. Persons have the attribute of dignity. Utilitarianism, by contrast, assigns persons a zero value, a null value. Okay, they have nothing. So this produces a difficulty for utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is subject to what I would call a motivational deficit that is imposed upon us the very instant we entertain the theory, right? Because at its very foundation, it says, well, there's only one good, and that's pleasure. That means, by implication, by strict logical implication, human beings have no value. Now, here's the problem. Why should one be motivated to benefit beings that have zero intrinsic value? How about a bunch of rocks? Should one muster much of one's energies calculating what is advantageous for the preservation of rocks or stones? Does that make any sense? They don't have any particular value, right? Instrumental value, but no intrinsic value. So should you bother yourself doing nice things for stones? That's a ridiculous picture. How about batches of chemicals? Another ridiculous picture. You say, no. Human beings differ from rocks and chemicals because human beings experience pleasure and pain. And because they experience pleasure and pain, we ought to be concerned for them. Okay, that just introduces this question. Why should one care about the pleasure and pain of beings that have no value and offer no intrinsic reason to love them or be concerned for them, or to respect them, or have any positive moral attitudes towards them, because they don't have any value? You guys follow me? Okay. Let's see. So that's a major problem. If you become a utilitarian, you deprive yourself of a reason to be a utilitarian, right? Sanction. Mill argues that it is enough that we can psychologically condition everyone to be concerned for everyone else. Right? He says, well, I'm not really concerned with the fact people have no value. We'll just set things up and we'll condition people, brainwash people effectively to be concerned for one another. So this pushes, so that's curious. I mean, so you're going to teach everyone that no one has any value, but we should be concerned for one another anyway. That's what that boils down to. Anyway, this pushes the problem back one step. Why, on his theory, should one take pains to condition others to be concerned for everybody else? Why should you bother doing that? Because I am concerned for other persons. Yeah, but what rational motivation is there justifying your concern for other persons? According to you, they don't have any value. So you're virtually in contradiction with yourself. Or let's put it this way, you're in a peculiar situation, Mill. You don't believe people have any intrinsic value, because you said it. At least that's implied by what you said. And nonetheless, you are concerned for these persons who have no value. Okay, I guess you're free to be concerned for persons who have no value, but then your concern becomes irrational, or at least non-rational, right? And you can't say that other persons, if they lack concern for others, right? You can't say that they're being irrational or non-rational. So that undermines your altruism. Your altruism states that one ought to. Your rational altruism states that one ought to benefit others for their sake. Right? That's central to utilitarianism. He doesn't want to be an egoist, but an altruist. One ought to benefit others for their sake. Well, why ought I to benefit something with zero value? Doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's that. So one can answer that, hold on, if I benefit people, it'll ultimately be advantageous to myself. That's the answer of an egoist, not an altruist. Okay? That's the answer that Hobbes would give. Now, Hobbes does give. That is Hobbes' answer. So if you're going to have an altruism, you have to offer some account of the value of human beings, so as to make sense of the duty to care for them. And this utilitarianism rules out. All right? That's where we are. Now, one might reply that since there is one value, pleasure, it becomes one's duty to increase that one good thing that is, and to decrease its contrary. I mean, it's not like, this is not a nihilism. Nihilism teaches that there is no good or no intrinsically good thing or no intrinsically bad thing, okay? And to think that there is self-deception. Okay. But this is not nihilism. This is the idea that there is something that's good by nature, and that's pleasure. All right. And something that's bad by nature, and that's pain. All right, very good. So now, if that's the case, now so they can argue, you do have an obligation, after all, that's to increase the amount of pleasure in the world, decrease the amount of pain, and produce that balance or that outcome in which the balance, or which is most favorable to the balance of pleasure over pain. Okay. But a person, now here's how I reply to that. A person who is motivated by the thought that he should increase the amount of higher pleasures in the world, while wholly disregarding and in fact denying the value of persons who experience those pleasures and pains, puts forward a very strange appearance, and I say is almost unrecognizable as a human being, or he's a very eccentric human being. And Mill would have everybody be, well, okay, we're trying to save Mill here. If this is a way of saving Mill, and this is the only way of saving Mill, then we'd all have to be that way, not really concerned for one another, but concerned for increasing the amount of higher pleasures that exist in the world. Okay? So I would maybe pay for you to take a course in music appreciation, but not because I give a whit about you, nor do I dislike you either. I look at you as a kind of vehicle, a convenient site where something good can happen, and that is an increase in the appreciation of Beethoven. As far as it being your increase and your enjoyment, who cares? Because you're worthless anyway, right? Now, worthless almost sounds like you have a negative value. Worthless in the sense of having no value. We don't hate you, we don't love you, no one loves me, or at least if we follow the scheme, no one would love me or hate me if we were rational, but we would love pleasure and hate pain. That would be a really weird world, okay? So it's possible one can brainwash people into thinking that way, and where you're sitting, you'd have to ask yourself if that's how you want to think, and that's how you want to lead your life, disregarding the person, not being concerned for the person, but being concerned for whether or not higher pleasures are occurring or not, and whether or not the absence of higher pleasures are occurring or not. Okay, so there's a wrinkle in this. I mean, Mill seems to discount lower pleasures, but he has to include lower pains, right? Surely. So the pains of being hungry and of suffering from a terrible illness. So in the final analysis, if we press Mill, he has to include lower pleasures and pains. If you include the lower pains, you have to include the lower pleasures. He does, I guess, if he's going to be logically consistent and come up with something that's even remotely realistic, he has to assign lower values to the lower pleasures. So a very intense pleasure of eating a chocolate brownie would get a lower value than the subtle pleasure of listening to Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. Okay. Or Art of the Fugue. Art of the Fugue is quite subtle. All right, folks. So, in conclusion, to motivate his altruism, Mill must admit at least one further thing possessed of positive value. Persons. That is, I mean, if we're not to enter that really weird universe, you're welcome to do it. Okay, but I think most persons will part company with Mill at that point. So, in order to motivate, have a real motivation, a rationally justified motivation to benefit people and care for people, we have to introduce a second positive value, and that's the value of a person with dignity. Now, once one does this, one must go further and give some kind of account of the dignity of the person, that in which the value of the person consists. Now, there have only been two accounts historically of the dignity of persons, and it is darned hard to imagine a third. So first, theists ground the value of persons who believe in God, they ground the value of persons in their similitude to the being of supreme value, God, who himself possesses supreme value because he is perfectly wise, good, and beautiful. And those are intrinsically good things, everyone sees it. Second, Kantians ground the value of persons in their being moral legislators. We spent a lot of time talking about that. So now, in the first case, the case of the Thomist, let's say, one introduces criteria by which one can distinguish higher from lower pleasures. We're back to that. Higher pleasures for Mill, we've seen, are those of scientific study, moral motivation, and aesthetic enjoyment. Those are the highest pleasures, right? Okay, remember, the pleasure you take in acting morally, that's intrinsically good. But the fact that you're taking pleasure in acting morally, that doesn't make your action moral. The consequences make it moral. Okay, you see that difference? So otherwise put, these are pleasures taken in the reflective experience of truth, goodness, and beauty. Mill praises pleasures taken in the reflective experience of the pursuit of truth, of doing what is good, right, and of enjoying beauty. These are the very attributes assigned in their perfection, truth, goodness, and beauty, to God. God is truth, he is goodness, he is beauty, according to that earlier system we looked at. Further, in recognizing them, one undermines consequentialism. All right. Why is consequentialism undermined? Well, now a noble action is good in virtue of its nobility, right? Because it has goodness built into it. Certain pleasures are good because of certain feature of the pleasure, not simply because they're pleasure, but that means other things that have satisfied that criterion are good as well. So if you perform a virtuous action, apart from the consequences, that action is good. Okay? An accident may occur and produce a bad consequence, like the person being run over as he crosses the street. It doesn't mean your action wasn't good. It was good. So that's the end of consequentialism. Now, there's another account of human dignity, and that's the one we saw in Kant. Okay, Kantian, so-called deontology. So deontology is the opposite of utilitarianism. Deontology rules out consequentialism. It dismisses consequences and says that all that matters is your motivation, not even your intention, just your motivation to do your duty. Okay. Your intention would be the specific end you're trying to accomplish. But if you try to accomplish that specific end because you're conscious that it's your duty to do so, it's the consciousness of your duty and doing it from that consciousness of duty that makes the action right and moral Kant. So Kantianism is the negation of utilitarianism, and Mill cannot accept that. So in the final analysis, okay, from where I'm standing, utilitarianism collapses under its own weight, and we find ourselves confronting the choice between Aristotelian-Thomism on the one hand and Kant on the other. That is, an Aristotelian-Thomism which maintains that persons can effectively functionally integrate their passions and their reason, and if not become absolutely perfect, become near enough to being perfect, right? Or Kant, who maintains that's not really attainable, and the best one can accomplish is to be self-controlled in accordance with one's consciousness of duty and the motivation to do one's duty for its sake. Okay, so that's what I have to say about John Stuart Mill, folks. Be well. I'll post assignments for you now.